welcome, Anne, to the podcast. It is so great to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me. It's really an honor to be here.
So we wanted to get you on the show for a couple reasons, and we'll kick that off with talking about your historical Regency romance called Restraint. Tell everybody what this book is about.
Restraint is about a young artist in Regency London. His name is John Waterfield, and he is inconveniently handsome. Now, I say inconveniently because he has a secret that he doesn't want high society to find out about him, which is that he is gay, because if they find out, he will be shunned and he will no longer have the business of the high society people who commission people like him for fancy portraits. He's the son of a clergyman, what's more, and so he's very, very uptight about his sexuality. Well, enter Viscount Penrith. His first name is Tristan, and he is a young aristocrat who has a terribly scandalous past that he is trying to live down. But he sees a portrait that John has painted of a lady in society, and he decides he wants a portrait too, a little bit on the naughty side, not naked or anything, but a little on the scandalous side. So he commissions the portrait, and as they begin working together, they start sort of hanging out together as well, and their attraction to each other is pretty undeniable. And society starts to notice that there's a little bit of spark there, and of course they gossip, and there's a lot of talk. So because John has this religious background with this very, very judgmental father, he is reluctant to do anything about his attraction to Lord Penrith. And because Lord Penrith really believes that his own nature is corrupt, he's not pushing himself on John. He's keeping it kind of cool. And so they manage to restrain themselves, hence the title of the novel, until the portrait is finished and out in the world. And then they finally manage to escape to one of Lord Penrith's country houses where they begin this summer love affair. They consummate their love, and it's very romantic, and they have this blissful time for about 3 weeks before an ex-lover of Tristan's appears on the scene, terribly jealous, and decides that blackmail would be a great way to get back at him. So the lovers are forced into this terribly painful choice of whether they will just give each other up and hide out so that society doesn't find out about them and the blackmailer can't bleed Tristan dry, or are they going to defy the world and have their love? So it winds up being this big, dramatic, romantic story of forbidden love that lasts a lifetime.
They get that HEA that everybody needs in a romance, just as it should be. Now, what inspired this book?
Well, here's a confession. It began life in the fan fiction space.
Okay.
That's not widely known. Now it is. I started just noodling on the idea of taking the two favorite actors of mine, handsome young guys, and putting them in the Regency, in the costumes, kind of like, paper dolls, and making them, the characters in a sort of a Georgette Heyer style frivolous Regency romance. Now, which fandom is not something that I discuss, but if readers are curious and they go looking, they can probably figure it out. Anyway, as I started to research this story, I found that, frivolity really wasn't in it when you're talking about two gay men in that period. So what I wound up with was much more dramatic and sort of ran quite a bit deeper than a typical Regency romance.
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot going on for these lovers. You've got the Regency period itself, which wasn't necessarily kind to gay folks. And then John's major religious upbringing, too. There had to be challenges here getting them to their HEA.
There were, definitely. There are traces in the historical record, as you guys are probably aware, that some queer people throughout history were able to get to that place of actual commitment and living together in some sort of married-like arrangement against all odds, right? But they were very rare. I do have a secondary couple in my story an older pair of gentlemen who have been able to achieve that because they're just so rich and so private that they can get away with anything. But what I was so interested in this story was how society had the power to control non-conforming people, even those at the pinnacle of privilege. You take a character like Viscount Penrith, he's like at the top of world history pyramid of privilege, right? He's just like the highest of the high. And even he was subject to these social restrictions. And I really got interested in this sort of capital R romantic idea of a love that would endure for a lifetime despite those restrictions, some of which these two guys do have to observe.
What is it about the Regency period that interests you to set stories?
Well, first of all, I grew up reading Georgette Heyer's Regency Romances. My first one came my way when I was probably about 12. And the thing about her books is that her research is absolutely impeccable. She presents a story on the surface that's kind of a fantasy version of the period, where she focuses apparently on the fancy clothes and the hairstyles and the beautiful horses and carriages and ballroom scenes and all that sort of thing, and manners. And the characters are these rich people with very few obstacles standing in the way of their love, except inner prejudices or something, kind of like Pride and Prejudice. But on every page, if you look, she goes deeper. She understands the whole socioeconomic background of the time she's writing in, the war that was going on at the time, all the class disparities, the poverty, the dangers of life in London. It's all there if you look for it. And that's what I got really interested in. So you take a character like Lord Penrith and ask, what if somebody like that was gay? And he was prohibited not only by custom, but by law, right, from loving who he would naturally love. Now, that was really interesting to me. And once I started digging into the research, upper class men in that time typically weren't prosecuted for the crime of sodomy. I put that in air quotes. But you got to be aware it was actually a capital crime in that time. And lower class men were executed for it. Not always, but sometimes it was not uncommon to have an execution for sodomy right up until the 1820s, which when they finally stopped doing that, they were still imprisoned for years after that, many years, probably more than a century after that. But if the criminal justice system would let these rich men go because they were so privileged and so, sort of sacrosanct, society would step in and society would try and control what it thought was deviant sexual behavior using this wonderful tool called blackmail. And blackmail practically was invented on the basis of, ratting out guys who were gay, right? And some of the greatest men of the age were ruined by the mere accusation of homosexuality, or ruined financially by blackmailers draining their resources on pain of, letting the world know that they were gay. So the stakes in the Regency were really high, and yet you have this juxtaposition with this incredibly privileged class of men who were sexually nonconforming. And I love that juxtaposition that creates the forbidden love story. And the Regency is just the perfect place to set that kind of story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think listeners of the show will know that I've only recently sort of dived into historicals, and I've found that sort of that idea of forbidden love and going against society, it really illustrates the strength of the romance of the two main protagonists. I'm interested in what your opinion is that why the Regency specifically has been such a mainstay of historical romance for so long. I mean, does it specifically just boil down to Jane Austen, or is there something else going on for readers of this genre?
It's hard to say. I don't really have like a scholarly theory about it. I think it does boil down to A, Jane Austen, and B, Georgette Heyer.
Yeah.
Georgette Heyer wrote, I forget how, 35 novels or something, a large body of work, much of it set in the Regency. And she really originated the Regency romance. In her days, she was looking back 100 years. Now we're looking back 200 years. But it's still fascinating. Just there's something about the time where we're right on the verge of like they were still writing with quills, and they didn't have matches yet, and the railroad hadn't quite come along yet. It was about to. So we're just prior to the sort of industrial revolution, mm-hmm. and yet it's still civilized enough that it's not just all mud and dirt and gross. And I think that's a lot of it. I really do.
It's the clothes and the balls. It's all about the balls.
Well, yeah, exactly. One way or another, it's all about the balls.
one of the reasons that we wanted to ask you to come on the show is that you are part of another podcast, specifically Sean Coyne's Story Grid podcast. And you were recently asked to come on and become part of like a mini series called the Masterwork Experiment. Can you explain what that experiment was all about?
Yeah, I can try. It was all new to me, and I'm a student of Sean Coyne's. He developed the Story Grid method and wrote the book, The Story Grid. Big fan and a student of his. And he has lately come up with this new methodology to help writers write stories better. He's always advocated that writers need to read a lot, and not just read, but deeply study masterworks in the genre that they want to write in. So he gives the example in his book of tearing the thriller Silence of the Lambs down to really tearing it down and really looking at what makes it tick, right? So he's taken this a step further, and this Masterwork Experiment is a new, even higher precision tool for doing that breakdown. So what we did over 10 episodes is we analyzed Annie Proulx's novella, Brokeback Mountain, which is a short novella, about 11,000 words. And we broke it down at what we call the beat level, which is a little bit like finding the skeleton, like scraping away the flesh, sorry to be gross, and finding the skeleton of the story. And my challenge then was to take that skeleton that we discovered and wrap like new story flesh around it, set in the Regency, because that's my area of expertise. So just in brief, we find in Brokeback Mountain, for example, which for readers who don't know or listeners who don't know, it's set in 1963 in Wyoming, a couple of cowboys. Probably everyone's seen the movie, right? The movie's very true to the novella. Anyway, so in the masterwork, we find some familiar beats, like the lovers meet at a job interview. And when you think about that, you've probably read stories where you've seen lovers meeting on the job or at an interview. And we have getting to know you over drinks at a bar. How many scenes like that have you seen or read? It's a very common scene type. We have a drunk scene. We have inclement weather forces them to share a bed. That's like one of my favorite kinds of scenes. It's very common in fan fiction, I can tell you that. And so on, right? So if you take away the specifics like the sheep and the mountains and Wyoming and cowboys and the sensibility of 1963 Western America, and you transpose it to England in 1812, you get a completely different story. But it's made of familiar things, right? So my job was to find the beats in Brokeback Mountain. We discovered 83 of them, and then those beats become my outline for the story that I'm now working on, which is my Regency Brokeback Mountain, if you will. And it makes it so that I'm no longer dependent on waiting for that bolt of inspirational lightning to strike me. I can just roll up my sleeves and get to work with the tools that I have. So it's been surprisingly liberating. It's a great, great technique.
When I started listening to these specific episodes of the Story Grid podcast, I was really fascinated, and it spurred me to actually go read Annie Proulx's story. And I talked about this a couple of episodes back. And first I was not stunned, but I was taken aback that Brokeback Mountain is, in fact, quite good. I think people know I have a bit of a distaste for literature with a capital L, but I thought Brokeback Mountain itself was exceptional. So when you and Sean went through the story beat by beat and examining some of the story choices that Annie Proulx made, I thought that was, number one, fascinating. But I thought the experiment part of the show was also really intriguing, taking as you said, the skeleton that Annie Proulx came up with and creating your own story. Can you give us a sense of what your story ended up being about?
Well, it hasn't ended up yet because it's still in progress. The draft is, I think I'm about 3/4 of the way at this point. Mm-hmm. But I have decided on my two protagonists. They are Matthew, who is a footman. That's an indoor servant, a guy who, as the name suggests, runs around and does errands for the master and the master's family in the great house. And Matthew is kind of proper, and he's a little bit ambitious. He sees himself rising in the ranks of the servant class. And then the other lover is Josiah, and he's in the lower order of the servant class. He's a groom, and that means he never even comes in the house. He lives in the stables, right? But he's kind of almost like a horse whisperer. He's an animal lover. He's a really natural man. He's also a foundling. He means he was an orphan left on the church steps as a baby, right? He has no education, but he's got this great sense of humor and this warm, loving heart. I just love Josiah. The biggest problem for him is that he's even more susceptible than Matthew is to the whims of his upper class overlords, right? And the reason for that is that the horses that he's in charge of, each one of them probably cost the master more than this guy is ever going to make in his entire life. The disparity is just incredible, right? So he's disposable compared to the actual horses. And so he's got to be really, really careful and kind of tiptoe, and he's at risk a lot of the time. Well, these two characters, these two young men, are tasked by their master with transporting a couple of these fancy hunting horses across country. And so they head out on this road trip, and it's on the road trip where they fall in love, they start their affair, they get into trouble, and the story progresses from there.
What's it been like creating this on the skeleton that you developed? We've talked on this show a lot, kind of giving our listeners who are readers kind of the clue to how the process works. This seems like plotting on a whole different level because you tore something else apart to get the plot that you're now hanging your story on.
Yeah, there's a tendency, at least when I first started, to feel really unoriginal, like I'm just stealing. This is not even creative. This is not original at all. But what I've learned is that there's no such thing as originality. There is nothing new under the sun, right? What each writer brings to the process is their own unique voice and style and experience. And so you get kind of a thumbprint of your personal DNA on the story. But it takes a while to realize that that's what you're doing when you're just starting out with, well, okay, first I need a interview scene where the lovers meet, and then I need a drunk scene where they, and it's like, okay, that doesn't feel very creative. But inside those very narrow constraints, that's where creativity can really start to bloom. It's wonderful. It's very exciting.
And your draft is public for folks to go see, whether they've been following on the Story Grid podcast or not. Where can people find that if they want to see like how you're doing, here in middle September?
It's insane, isn't it, that I would do that?
It would terrify me as a writer. I got tense for you when Sean read part of your draft on the podcast.
Sorry. Well, I'm working in a Google Doc. That's how I always work. I like Google Docs. So it's a document that I have made public just for viewing, right? And people can come and look at it. You may catch me at work in there some days. It's been known to happen. It's messy, it's chaotic. People who are not writers themselves and not accustomed to the first draft process might think, oh my God, this is terrible. But the process of shaping it, this is right now I'm in the process of shoveling sand into the sandbox, or you might say assembling building materials, and I haven't really built anything yet. I hope by the time we're live with this episode there will be more structure there. Anyway, I have created a special link just for listeners of this podcast if they're interested. It's a little landing page where they can find a link to my Google Doc, and that is at annhawley.net/BGF podcast. And I hope people will feel free to drop by. And if you catch me working in the document, leave a little comment, say hello.
Oh, that's very cool. Now, what's the plan for releasing this finished story?
Well, it's very exciting because it gets published at the end. We have a date in Sean's StoryGrid Editions publishing calendar for December 2020, so a little bit over a year from now. And it's going to come out in print. It'll be a little thin, slim print volume plus an ebook. And I also hope that we will get an audiobook, and we will if I can find a good British narrator. And I'm open to suggestions, so if anybody knows a good British narrator, let me know because I'm looking.
Both of these stories with Restraint and what you're working on with Brokeback Mountain are gay romances. What attracts you into that genre to tell the story of two men falling in love?
This is a question that I have done quite a bit of soul searching on over the years because it's a tough question to answer. Personally, I am asexual. I have never conformed to any of society's expectations about a normal or a proper relationship. So I always have felt somewhat alienated from mainstream love stories involving heterosexual couples because it's just not part of my life. Neither, of course, is a gay love story, but somehow that's less mainstream and feels less alienating to me. So it's odd that my writing is just terribly romantic, but I don't feel a lot of romantic in myself, in my own life. But as I've said, I do love these stories of forbidden love where the barriers to the two lovers getting together are entirely external. They love each other, they're soulmates, they want to be together, and external forces keep them apart. Can you say Romeo and Juliet? And so I have found that gay love stories set in the past, or there are certain places and cultures today where you could still set them contemporarily that have that forbidden aspect built in.
And pulling back from that even further, what got Anne Hawley interested in writing in general?
Oh, I was a big reader as a little tiny kid, and I just said, there's not enough of these books that I like, which at that time was like the Narnia books and children's fantasy, they used to call it that. And I said, I'm going to write some more. And so I started my first novel when I was 9, and I finished it when I was 33. And it's not worth publishing, but I still have it around. Someday I might, pull it back out, dust it off, and see if I can fix it using story grid principles. You never know.
That's great that you took what you started at 9 and did finish it. I mean,
yeah, it's pretty amazing, really.
That's pretty incredible. So besides finishing up the work you're doing from the Masterwork Experiment, what else is coming up next for you that our listeners might be interested in?
Well, I've started a new novel. It's going to be set in Portland, which is my hometown and where I currently live, in 1905, so turn of the last century. It's going to have a couple of love subplots, one gay, one lesbian, but that's not the primary story. The primary story is about an occult society, kind of like the Order of the Golden Dawn, and they practice ritual magic, and I'm examining sort of the question of whether that kind of magic is actually real. So it skirts kind of a line between reality and fantasy, and that's what I'm working on now.
That sounds super cool. And what is the best way for everyone to keep up with you online, to get news about that and the Masterwork Experiment as it moves towards publication and everything else?
Well, I'm on Twitter at Anne Hawley. That's ANNEHAWLEY. Always needs to be spelled for people. My website is annehawley.net, and people can subscribe to my list there where if they do, they will get a chapter a day of Restraint for free in their inbox. It's beautifully formatted, looks just like the book, and you can just keep getting chapters till you get the whole book. Furthermore, I am the host of the Story Grid Editor Roundtable, which is a podcast for writers. And so if there are writers among your audience who are interested in advancing their understanding of the story grid method, that's what we do. We analyze a movie or a novel every week according to story grid principles. It's a fun little podcast.
Indeed it is. I've enjoyed some of the movies that you've been breaking down over there.
Oh, thank you.
I think as a non-writer, I would even be fascinated just to hear how the movies get, built on a story level occasionally.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting.
So, Anne, thank you so much for coming and talking about Restraint and the work you're doing on the Brokeback Mountain Masterwork. And we look forward to hearing more about that in 2020.
Well, thank you very much.